Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Kirk YouTube channel. I'm your host of this video, Reverend Jake Zabel, and welcome to our mini-series Ask the Consistory, where we answer your questions. And today I'm addressing the question, is cannibalism a sin? And now you might be wondering, what on earth are you talking about, Pastor Jake? Why are you even asking that? Isn't it quite obvious that cannibalism is a sin? And I'm going to say, yeah, but this channel is about answering people's questions. And while I was not asked this question by anyone who was a Christian, for those who don't know, the co-elk is very small, and I actually am a tent maker pastor. Not that I make tents, but that I have a secular civil job that I use to fund my ministry. And in doing that, I have co-workers who aren't Christian that I interact with on like a weekly basis. And sometimes they have questions. And the discussion of cannibalism came up at work, and they actually asked me whether it's a sin and why is it a sin. And so I had to give them some answers there, but I thought I might as well actually answer this video. I might as well take the chance to take my answer and put it in video form. And so I'm going to discuss cannibalism, but we're going to discuss a couple different aspects of cannibalism. We're going to discuss cannibalism more broadly. We're going to discuss something known as necro-cannibalism. So that's not killing a person. That's if you're eating a person who's already dead. There's also survival cannibalism. So that's, you know, you wouldn't do it normally, but you're desperate for food, so you eat somebody in desperation. And then there's also voluntary cannibalism, as in like somebody donated their body to be cannibalized. So there are 4 different things we're going to look at in this video. And I would recommend that if you'd like to learn more about this, the website Got Questions, which I know is not Lutheran, but even non-Lutherans can still teach true theology from time to time. Got Questions did do an excellent article on this topic of cannibalism, so I'm going to plug that article and recommend you go and read it as well. I'm going to probably steal some stuff from it for this video. But basically the question is cannibalism a sin? And the first thing we're going to look at is just the idea of cannibalism generally. And the thing is, cannibalism is often always seen as a bad thing in Scripture. It's mentioned only like a few times in Scripture, particularly in like the Mosaic laws where it's condemned, but it's also mentioned in places like the prophets where it is part of God's judgment, where the people of God are being forsaken and they turn to cannibalism. And so we need to ask, is cannibalism a sin? Well, I think the first answer is probably yes. Now we're going to give a definite answer at the end of this video, but we're going to start off with the premise that yes, cannibalism most likely is a sin because it is seen as a bad thing. Now people will object and say, well, hold on. Now the 5th commandment is thou shalt not kill. So I get the idea of killing somebody to eat them would be considered murder, and that would be sin. But what about if they were already dead? What if I just came across a dead body? Could I then eat that person? I'm not killing them, so it's not murder. But would just eating them be sin? Now, if we already ignore the fact that Scripture generally sees cannibalism as a bad thing and as part of God's judgment and punishment on people, is just eating somebody a bad thing? Well, the real question is defiling a dead body a bad thing? You see, we eat dead animals, but we are allowed to kill animals. We're allowed to farm animals, eat animals, because they're not made in the image of God. When Noah gets off the ark in Genesis, God gives Noah the right to capital punishment, the death penalty. And he says, if anybody sheds the blood of somebody, their blood should be shed. And the reason God says is because man is made in the image of God. If you kill somebody, you're attacking God's image. And so the question is, once a person is dead, does defiling their corpse still an attack against the image of God? And generally, as Christians, we would say yes. Christians have this idea of reverence for the dead. We bury the dead. Traditionally, churches have rejected cremation because it was seen as defiling the corpse. Because we Christians, we're not Gnostics. We don't believe that the human is just a soul and the body is like this husk that you just got to wear around like your clothes. No, in Christian theology, we believe that your body is part of you. You are body, soul, and spirit. You're not just a spirit trapped in a body. Your body is you. This is why we call it the remains when you die. It's something that is yours that is left here. When you go and you bury someone in the ground, when you visit somebody's grave, you are visiting them. It's not the same as like if you went to the house where they used to live, or you found an item of clothes, or something that used to belong to them. Their body isn't just something that belonged to them, their body is them. And that body, whether it is living or lifeless, is still a human body created in the image of God and should be treated as such. So therefore, you can't just eat it, because it's not just a random hunk of meat like it would be if it was an animal. It's still a human body. It is still a human person created in the image of God. I don't care if they're lifeless. I don't care if they're dead. They are still created in the image of God, and you can't harm them. Which would mean that this would go on to the next two cases, voluntary cannibalism and survival cannibalism, that you can't just defile someone's dead corpse. I don't care if they do it voluntarily or whether they do it for a case of emergency. You can't just defile somebody's corpse, and eating somebody would count as defilement. Now, the case though comes up is voluntary. So, okay, well, what if they permitted me to eat their corpse? Well, just because someone permits you to do something doesn't make it right. The Bible condemns sodomy, but just because someone volunteers to be sodomized does not mean that that now becomes a good thing. If I gave you permission to come and chop my arm off, that doesn't make it a good thing. We have the issue of transgenderism, where people go and get their genitals cut off as part of a sex change surgery. Just because they did it voluntarily doesn't make it right. So voluntary cannibalism doesn't make it any less of a sin. Now the last question is, again, what about survival cannibalism? Like, the Bible does talk about, cases of emergency. In the New Testament, the disciples were allowed to break the Sabbath and pick grains because they were starving. Jesus points to the Old Testament where King David was able to go into the temple and eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat because it was an emergency situation because he was starving. We allow emergency baptism, where people who aren't ordained can baptize children in cases of emergency. So if it's an absolute emergency and you're starving, could you then eat somebody? And again, no. Just because it's an emergency doesn't justify you breaking the law. See, there are things like, self-preservation, where you could kill somebody out of self-defense. But that's not really an issue of you breaking God's law. You are permitted self-defense because you are allowed to defend yourself. This actually comes to the grounds of the rule of the government to wield the sword. See, the right to wield the sword is that the government has the right to have a military or a police force to wield the sword to punish criminals. As a house father, I am the government of my home, and if the people in my home are threatened, I'm allowed to wield the sword to protect them, as you can see in the Old Testament, where people were permitted to kill intruders if they broke into their house in the middle of the night. The Bible also, though, permits this on a personal level. If somebody is threatening your own life, you do have a right to wield the sword to protect the kingdom of your body. But that doesn't mean that you can go and just commit any crime because it's a, quote, emergency. I can't just go and rob a bank because I'm poor. So just because I'm hungry doesn't mean I can just go and eat a person. Again, that happens in Scripture where people do eat people out of a case of necessity, but that was part of God's judgment on them. There's also the sense of the lack of faith in God to provide daily bread. Like, if you are in such a case where you are starving to death, there is a sense where you trust in God to provide you with something to eat, or that He will provide you with the strength to get through. And if he doesn't, maybe it's God's will that you don't get through this and it's your time to go to heaven. For you to then go and commit a sin just because you are hungry is not a reasonable justification. No more than it would be reasonable justification to rob a bank just because you're poor or in debt. So, is cannibalism a sin? Yeah, it's definitely a sin. Not only is murder a sin, but just the defilement of a corpse, the defiling of somebody who is made in the image of God, that is a sin. And even if somebody volunteered to have you defile their corpse, does not give you the permission and the right to do so. And just because you're desperate and that you're starving does also not give you the permission to do so. So yeah, that's my answer to the question, is cannibalism a sin? Yeah, and you shouldn't do it. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.